In this demonstration, you're going to learn how to use the brush mask in Lightroom. Before we look at the specifics of how to use the different settings of the brush mask, what we're going to do first is go over some of the concepts that surround the brush mask. So the brush mask is very similar to a paintbrush. It allows you to make precise, localized adjustments to specific areas in your photo. And you're going to do so by painting directly on top of the image. This is unlike global adjustments that affect the entire photo. So with brush masks, like all the other masks, the idea here is you're going to make localized adjustments to specific areas of your photo. Some of the key features of the brush mask include the ability to customize your brush settings. That's primarily what we're going to be looking at in this demonstration. So we're going to be looking at things like the size of the brush, how to make it larger, how to make it smaller, how that impacts the brush marks. We're also going to take a look at the feathering setting, the flow setting, and the density setting. So there are 4 basic brush settings that you need to be familiar with when you're working with these with this brush mask tool. And again, that's going to be the primary focus of this demo that I'm going to be doing today. So all this allows you all these 4 settings allow you to define precise control over the mask that you're creating, allows you to add multiple adjustments. You're also going to have overlay and visual guides as you're using this tool. And all 4 of these settings work together. So you do not use them in isolation. They're always used together. So you have to have a good understanding of the 4 settings and how they interrelate. So let's talk a little bit more about those brush settings. Again, there are 4 customizable brush settings that are part of the brush mask. The first and easiest to understand is the size. That's simply the size of the brush, and that controls the area that's affected by the mask. And here, the smaller the brush, the finer the detail of the mask. The larger the brush, the more broad detail you're going to be working with in terms of creating that mask. So size is pretty easy to understand. And again, that's going to be, you kind of see that here is the first setting of the brush mask. The second setting is feathering. Feathering is used to soften the edges of the brush. This is used to create a smooth transition between masked and unmasked areas. The higher the value here, the more gradual the blending will be. The lower the value, the less gradual your blending will be. And so this will typically be a value between 0 and 100. 100 would be the most gradual blending. 0 would be the least gradual blending, or no blending at all, no gradual blending at all. And again, we're going to take a closer look at all 4 of these settings throughout this demonstration. So if it doesn't make sense now, it will by the end of this demo. The third setting is going to be flow. Flow is used to control the intensity of the brush stroke. The lower the value here, the lower the setting value, and will define that you're going to build up the effect gradually. So if you have a very low value for flow, what this allows you to do is it allows you to gradually build up the intensity of the effect. So, one stroke would be only a small amount of paint applied, whereas if you have a higher value here and you do 1 stroke, it's going to apply more paint effectively to that stroke. And then the final setting is going to be density. Density is used to limit the opacity of the mask. So in other words, how transparent or how opaque do you want that brush mark to be? So the lower the value here, the more brush strokes it will be required to gradually build up the effect. So let's take a look at each of these settings in more detail now. Again, starting with size. Size is, of course, the easiest to understand. That just simply controls the area affected by the mask. So the smaller the brush, the finer the detail. And you can see we have 3 different settings here, 10, 25, and 40. You can see that on the left-hand side of the screen. And just to the right of that, that is simply the size of the brush indicated by that value. And then you see an example. So obviously the smaller the brush, the smaller the stroke, the larger the value, the larger the stroke. So that one's pretty easy to understand. And again, as we're going through these 4 settings, keep in mind that these are all interrelated. They all work together. The second setting is going to be feathering. Right? So feathering is used to soften the edges of the brush. This is used to create a smoother transition between masked and unmasked areas. The higher the value here, the more gradual the blending will be. So this is going to be a value between 0 and 100. A value of 100 is the most gradual blending that you can have. You can see an example of that in the first brush stroke. If you bump that down to something like 50, you'll have less of a gradual blending. And then if you go all the way down to 0, there's no gradual blending to it at all. It's just one, the stroke is the same on the inside as it is on the edges. So feathering, again, this is just used to control how gradual the blending will be. And just a lot of this just depends on what kind of photo you're working with and what type of mask you're trying to create. Third setting is going to be flow. So flow controls the intensity of the brush stroke. And as I said before, the lower the setting that you define here will affect that by requiring multiple brush strokes to gradually build up the intensity. And again, this is going to be a value between 0 and 100. The higher the value here that you have, the fewer strokes you'll need. The lower the value, the more strokes that you will need. Right? But sometimes you want a very, you just want maybe a very fine mask. At other times, you might want a very thickly applied mask. So again, just kind of depends on what you're doing. But flow is used just to control the intensity of each brush stroke as you make them. And then finally, density is the final setting that we'll look at here. This is used to control transparency of your mask. 100, a value of 100 here, if you're defining a value of 100 for density, that means that your stroke will be fully opaque. In other words, you can't see through to something below that. And then the further you go left, right, the smaller the value, the more transparent your stroke will ultimately be. So if you define something like 25 or even 50, these are the maximum amounts of opacity that you can define. So in other words, if you define a value of 25, no matter how many strokes you apply to a certain area, it's never going to build up to more than 25. Whereas if you define a value of 100, which is fully opaque, eventually as you're stroking the brush, right, eventually it will become fully opaque. Right? And again, all four of these settings work in conjunction, so they work together. And so it's important that you have an understanding of how to use them together and what each of them does so that you can more accurately, not necessarily accurately, but it gives you more control over what that mask will ultimately look like and what type of coverage you'll get for the mask. Now, the second part of this demonstration, the second part of this video is going to go into a demonstration showing you exactly how each of these four settings work. We'll be using a white background. I think it's helpful to use a white background rather than an actual photo as you're starting to learn these different settings, mainly so that you can see as you're creating strokes with your brush, you can see exactly what type of effect each of these settings have. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move to demonstration now. Just wanted to kind of cover some of the basic concepts of the brush mask and all the different settings that you can apply. Okay, so let's turn our attention to actually doing a demonstration of some of these different brush mask settings. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be using just a white background image. The reason that I do this is just to better illustrate the different settings that come with the brush mask. It's just kind of easier to see the effect of these settings on a white background as opposed to a regular photo. And then in future demonstrations, I'll show you how the brush mask works on an actual photo. But in the beginning, right, when you're first learning the different settings of the brush mask, it's just kind of helpful to see this on a white background. I've already brought up the Create Mask pane. We do that by just simply clicking in Lightroom on the mask button that you see here. That brings up the Create New Mask pane. And from here, we'll just simply select Brush. That adds your new brush mask. And of course, here are your four settings: size, feather, flow, and density. We're going to start with size. All right, so size just controls the size of the paintbrush. The lower the size, obviously the smaller the brush, the larger the size, the larger the brush. Now, in terms of changing the size, you can do this in different ways, and this is going to apply to really to all these different settings, but we're going to start with size. So you can use the slider that you see here with your mouse, and just you can slide it back and forth to make the setting larger or smaller as needed. You can also type in a value. So if I want to type in a value, size of 10. You can hit 10 and hit return. With the size setting, you can also use your keyboard as well. On your keyboard, you should have a couple of keys that contain curly and square braces. It should be on the right-hand side of your keyboard. You should have a button that contains an opening curly brace and a square brace, and a closing curly brace and closing square brace. And so you can just click on, and I'm doing this now, I'm just clicking on my keyboard. You'll notice that you can make these larger or smaller. All right, so you got multiple ways of changing the size of your brush. And so we're going to start with a size of 10, like you see here, which is a fairly small brush size. And what I'm going to do now is just simply create a stroke that illustrates the size. So I'll create the stroke. You can see that here. I can go back and forth a few times. That's, again, that's the size setting. Now, if you make it larger, right, if I change this to something like 20 instead of 10, your brush obviously becomes larger. And when you paint a brush stroke, obviously the brush stroke becomes larger. Set it to something like 40 and it's larger still, right? So again, that size is pretty straightforward, very easy to understand. Size simply controls how large is the paintbrush that you're going to be using. So that's pretty easy to illustrate and to understand. That's the easiest setting to understand. We'll next turn our attention to the feather setting. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and delete this existing mask and then simply recreate it so that it's easier to understand. So I'll recreate the brush, and this time we're going to focus in on the feather setting. I'm gonna set the size for the brush back down to something pretty small. We'll just we'll do something like a size of 8 here, so we can illustrate this a little bit better. So the feather setting, as I mentioned earlier, is used to control, as you're drawing in these brush strokes, it's used to control the gradient of how how the brush stroke blends as you move out towards the edges. And so with the feather, it can be a size of 0 all the way up to 100. 100 is going to be the most blending that you can get. And so if you draw in something here with a size of 8 and a feather of 100, I'm actually going to change the density here as well, just to make this a little bit easier to see. And so if I add in a stroke here at size of 8, you'll see that as you move from the most inside part of the mask to the outside, there's a gradual decrease in the mask effect. And 100 is as high as you can go. Now, if I bump this down to something like 50, probably easier to type in that, now you'll see less of a blending effect. So as I start to draw this in now, again, you see less of a blending effect. Right? So as you move towards the edges, not quite the blending effect that you had when you have a size of 100. So it just depends on how much blending you need as you move from the interior of your brush stroke to the outside of the brush stroke. Now, if I bump this down to something even further, right, something like 25, you'll see even less blending. See how it's just kind of a thick line there, and you don't have as much blending from the interior part of the brush stroke to the edges of the brush stroke. All right, so that was 100, 50, and 25. And then if you set it all the way down to something like 0, you have no blending at all, right? So it's just a thick line, right? Just a thick brush stroke with no blending at all. All right, so that's feathering. So feathering controls the blending, or how it blends as you move from the interior of your brush stroke to the exterior of your brush stroke. I'm going to reset some of this a little bit. I'm going to set feathering up to, we'll just say 50, so that I can illustrate flow. So far we've looked at size, we've looked at feather. The next thing we'll look at is flow. And again, I'm going to just restart with a fresh mask here. Delete that, recreate it. And what we're going to look at now is the flow. So the flow is used to control how many brush strokes it takes to completely fill in the mask. Right? And so we'll start with a value of 100, and we'll start drawing in. And so when you have your flow set to 100, it's essentially telling it with this flow setting, how much paint do I want to release with each brush stroke? And when you set it to its highest value of 100, it essentially releases all the paint with one stroke. So it takes fewer strokes to fill in your mask. Now, if you start bumping this down For instance, if I set this down to 50, now you'll notice my initial stroke is not as thick, right? So it's applying less paint to the brush. So it takes more brush strokes to ultimately fill in the mask. You can still get it to where it looks the same as if you had a flow of 100, but it takes more brush strokes, right? So it's releasing less paint with each stroke. Now, if you set this even further down to something like 25, now it will take even more brush strokes to fill that in. So the first stroke is very light, right? And so you can see I can continue to paint back and forth, but it takes more effort here, more brush strokes to fill that mask completely in. So flow simply controls the flow of how much paint is released with each stroke of the brush. Right? So, sometimes it just depends on your situation, right? Sometimes you want to release everything at once. At other times, you might want to gradually fill in your mask and gradually build up that mask. But again, it just kind of depends on your needs. Right now, we're just kind of trying to understand the settings and how those settings work before we actually apply them to a photo. All right, so at this point, we've looked at 3 settings: size, feather, and flow. And then lastly, we'll turn our attention to density. Now, density, this setting controls the transparency of the mask itself. So the higher the value, the more dense or more opaque the mask will be. The lower the setting, the more transparent the mask will be. So again, I'm going to start over with a fresh mask. Just delete my existing mask 1. Again, recreate it. I'm going to set my flow a little higher here. I'm going to set that back up to 75, and we'll leave density at 100 for now. So when I have a density setting that's at its highest, which is 100, what you're effectively doing there is you're giving yourself the ability to make the mask completely opaque. So there's no transparency involved here at all. So you'll notice as I start drawing this in, now I have a flow of 75, so it still takes me a few strokes, but ultimately I'm going to get a completely opaque mask. All right. Now, if I bump this down to something like 75, what I'm effectively doing here is applying a transparency to that mask. So it will never be able to fill up more than 75%. So it will never be completely opaque. No matter how many times I stroke across here, it never gets quite as thick as what you have here. And again, just to kind of bump this down further, if I had to go all the way down to something like 40, now as I start stroking this in, it doesn't matter how many strokes I apply here, it never gets thicker than 40%. Right? So the lower this value, the more transparency you will have with your mask. And again, just kind of depends on what you're doing with your photos and in terms of the mask that you're creating. Sometimes you want it to be you want that mask to completely fill the underlying photo. At other times, you want to have a sort of a transparency applied to that mask so that the changes you make don't completely fill in or not quite as thickly applied to your underlying photo. All right, so those are the 4 settings. Again, the brush mask itself is fairly easy to understand. It's essentially just a paintbrush, but you do have these 4 settings, right? And so you need to have a full understanding of what each of these settings do. Some of them are quite simple, right? Size is very easy to understand. But some of these other settings are a little bit more complex. And of course, you have to understand that they work in conjunction, right? They all work together. Right? They don't work in isolation. So when you're defining these different settings, you need to understand how they interrelate and how they work together to complete the mask that you're ultimately going to create. And as I said at the beginning of this demo, it's helpful to understand, to see this in the context of a white background image so that you can fully grasp what each of these settings do and how they impact the mask that gets created. Now, in a future demonstration, we'll actually apply the brush mask to a photo. But as I said before, it's very helpful in the initial stages here of your learning process to understand exactly how each of these settings work and kind of how they interrelate. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of this demonstration. As I said before, we'll be doing more detailed demonstrations on this brush mask as well as some of the other masks in future demonstrations. That's it for now. I appreciate you joining me, and we'll talk to you again soon.